Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going on a truly mind-bending journey. We're going to challenge the absolute most fundamental assumptions you hold about the universe and how you perceive it. I'm talking about the very building blocks of reality here. So, clear your mind, get focused, and get ready to completely rethink everything you thought you knew about the physical world. Let's get right into it.
I want you to take a second right now and just look around the physical space you're in. Look at your desk, maybe your cup of coffee, the walls of the room. They feel solid, right? Like they're distinct, separate things. But what if I told you that this common sense, everyday experience of the physical world might actually be a massive illusion? What if the very concept of an object is just an elaborate trick your brain plays on you so you can navigate the world?
Okay, let's dive into this. The source material we're unpacking today makes a bold, really paradigm-shifting claim. Basically, our entire container-based model of reality, the idea that the universe is just a giant box filled with discrete, separate items, is entirely wrong at the foundational level. We naturally assume that objects just cannot be in the exact same place at the same time. But the data tells a totally different story. At its core, reality doesn't behave like a collection of objects. Reality behaves quantum mechanically.
And that brings us to Part 1, the crisis of classical objects, the trap of common sense.
To really understand where we're going with this, we've got to understand where we've been. See, since the 17th century, our science has been pretty much trapped by an object-based logic. We naturally rely on three things: mutual exclusivity, binary separability, and fixed identity. And look, I totally want to validate your everyday experience here. This makes absolute sense on a macroscopic level. We rely on spatial exclusivity. You intuitively know that two objects literally cannot occupy the exact same physical space simultaneously. In classical mechanics, this is backed up by Pauli's exclusion principle, which prevents the interpenetration of bulk matter. Simply put, it's why you don't fall straight through your chair when you sit down.
But here is where we hit a massive scientific wall. This really rigid need for hard boundaries, it creates a deeply fragmented worldview. The logic of the object essentially becomes an exclusionary filter. It acts like a strategic bottleneck in our scientific inquiry, pretty much ensuring that any model we derive from these classical axioms is just, a superficial approximation of what's actually happening. By constantly focusing our attention on the perceived parts, we're completely obscuring the integrated structural continuity of the physical vacuum itself.
Which takes us directly to Section 2, the quantum subversion, breaking the rules.
So, when our investigative precision finally advanced enough to penetrate the subatomic threshold, this discrete, classical logic completely and catastrophically failed. Down at the quantum level, reality absolutely refuses to conform to the requirements of quote-unquote objects. Instead, it demands a total abandonment of rigid boundaries in favor of fluid, probabilistic states. Wave-particle duality isn't just some quirky piece of physics trivia you memorized to pass a test. It's a fundamental subversion of the object as a valid category of existence. It strategically dismantles the entire concept of classical matter. By replacing localized definite points with spatially distributed wave functions, quantum mechanics invalidates the very notion of fixed positionality.
The crucial point here is summarized perfectly by this direct quote from our sources. Particles are waves as well as particles. Waves are particles as well as waves. Wow. That is heavily mind-bending. Because this isn't just a linguistic paradox, right? It's the actual structural reality of our universe. Think about the so what factor here. It is completely devastating for classical logic. If an entity inherently possesses the properties of a wave, it lacks a definitive edge. It has no hard boundary. And without a hard boundary, can you really call it an object?
Let's move to Section 3 and see exactly how this builds, abandoning the object premise, the cognitive artifact.
Because there are no definitive edges at the quantum level, we're forced into a rather startling realization about human psychology and physics. The boundary you perceive between an entity and its environment, it isn't objectively real. It's merely a cognitive artifact. It's a biological shortcut that the observer uses to simplify incredibly complex field interactions so our brains can actually process them without overheating. The environment actually is the entity. What you perceive as an isolated object is merely a localized peak in a continuous, fluid field. Think about that. Our human brains are essentially committing a massive error every single day. We're walking around artificially drawing lines and slicing up a perfectly unified quantum whole into perceived parts, largely just so we don't trip over the furniture in our living rooms. We have quite literally confused the map we drew for the actual territory.
When we look at the consequences of a truly quantum mechanical reality, the implications are staggering. We see exclusivity invalidated by phenomena like superposition, things that are logically impossible under object-based rules. We see discrete boundaries dissolve thanks to entanglement. Ultimately, our entire logic of objects just collapses. If the universe's fundamental building blocks don't adhere to the rules of objects, then any worldview built on the existence of objects is fundamentally decoupled from reality. It's just obsolete mapping.
Which brings us to our final section, a new reality of distinctions, rebuilding reality.
Okay, so if classical objects are effectively an illusion, how do we fix this crisis? How do we map the world accurately? Well, the solution provided in our source material is that we must fundamentally stop asking about things and their properties. Instead, we need to shift our focus entirely to investigating the fundamental nature of the quantum field itself. The sources offer a specific protocol for this, and it requires two major steps. Step 1 is axiomatic suspension. We must formally, actively abandon the premise that discrete objects exist as the primary building blocks of reality. Step 2 is adopting a calculus of distinctions. This means investigating the physical and logical consequences of assuming division. We need to map the emergent properties that happen only when a unified system is logically or linguistically partitioned by us. This is a massive, crucial pivot away from a logic of things toward a much more rigorous, process-oriented logic of distinctions.
And this right here is the climax of this whole explainer, the critical takeaway you really need to internalize today. Reality is not an assembly of discrete parts, it is a quantum mechanical continuum that our own logic mistakenly divides. This framework completely redefines your relationship with the universe. You are no longer just a passive spectator sitting back and watching separate entities interact. You are a highly active participant, and it is your very own logic of distinction that's generating the fragmentation you're studying.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, really paradigm-shattering question to ponder as you go about the rest of your day. When you look out into the world, are you actually observing the universe as it truly is, or are you just observing the arbitrary distinctions you created to understand it? It's a lot to think about for sure. Thanks for exploring this fascinating framework with me, and keep questioning everything.